Alrighty.
Empire sounded much more Western civilization that's normally understood. Many ideas, even if it were only just of significance to the Persians and not to all of humanity, but it's of significance to everybody. So this is not a minor threat we're talking. Okay, so let's go back to the story and we'll wrap up here. So returning to the story. So after the Magi had left, we read in Matthew chapter 2, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph, which is to say Jesus' dad, in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child and destroy him." And Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." So Matthew, as we're going to start to see through this, and if you were to read his whole gospel, he loves this all the way through. He wants to quote Old Testament scripture and say, this is how Jesus is a fulfillment of that. And so the idea of it is, like I say, at the base of that, if we just take the equation backwards, you say, what the early Christians have is that Jesus' life is a fulfillment of Old Testament scripture, and anything that's in the Old Testament is going to be something that Jesus has done, because there's an equal sign here. And so in this case, when we look at what that scripture is, we go back to Hosea 11:1. If you read the entire quote, it says, "When Israel was a child, then I loved him and called my son out of Egypt." Right. So it's not referring to a Messiah at all. This is not a messianic prophecy. It is simply God, through the prophet Hosea, talking about Israel itself. And so it's talking about the Israelite national epic, the Exodus story, right? So it's not a messianic prophecy, it's the Exodus story. So how is this, doesn't Matthew think anybody can look it up? What's going on here, right? So the way it works is that early Christians have not a literalistic, they're not literalists at all with Scripture, they're typological interpretation, a typological reading of Scripture. And so what that means is just like in Plato, where we have the form and the like essentially the wax and the form, or anyway, and the form. I'm trying to think what the other thing is. Form and anyway, expression. So in this sense, then, reflection, yeah. So Christ obviously is the form, and so therefore the antitype to then Israel, which is essentially symbolic of Christ. So Christ's life is the antitype, it is the thing, and then this past thing that had happened was a reflection or a prefiguring of it as far as the Christians meant, right? That's their interpretation, that's how they read the scripture. So going forward, when Herod saw, Matthew continues, that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all of the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. So it's the massacre of the innocents, as it's called in the Christian tradition. So this again is a typological construction of Matthew's narrative. So the massacre by Herod is a typological, is the, again, the antitype. Christ's birth is the antitype of Moses' birth, the type, where there is the massacre of the innocents under Pharaoh in the Exodus story. And Moses is put in the basket, you may remember, to save his life, and then all of the Israelite boys are put to death. So, this is meant to be read, then, I think, as a literary or a theological event, and we shouldn't be reading this as a historical event. In any case, this was a question that you had before about, is there anybody else who's talking about this story other than the gospel? Do we have any other literary accounts? Is there anything else, any other evidence? And the answer is no. So this story occurs only in Matthew. We have a wealth of sources for Herod's reign. Very unusual, actually. So in lots of these kind of things, we don't have this for the contemporary Parthian rulers of the vast successor state to the Persian Empire. We don't have this kind of records for that we do have for Herod. Includes very detailed information because there's this guy, Flavius Josephus, who writes a lot about the whole period. He's writing later in the 1st century, but he's pretty antagonistic to Herod, so he's not a big Herod booster, and he loves gossip, and he loves to badmouth and tell all kinds of things and tell these kind of bad stories. If there had been a thing where Herod had killed all of the boys in Bethlehem, that was something that he'd want to put in there. It would be quite a big scandal. So this is an argument from negative evidence. We would say, well, it's weird that this wouldn't appear, but it's pretty weird that this would not be in there if it had something that happened. And so I think actually all historians agree that this is not a historical event, the massacre of the innocents. It's something that is a literary device created by Matthew in order to have this archetype of the Exodus story. So let's just end Matthew's account and get the rest of the sense of it. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he gets a lot of these dreams. He's good. So anyway, he went away to the district of Galilee, and there he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled, he will be called a Nazarene. Okay, so where's this, right? So we had this story that we've been taking place before here in Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and now we're going to be moved up here to Nazareth in the Galilee, right? So among the few things that historians are prepared to say about the historical Jesus with any kind of certainty is that he is of Nazareth. So when we were talking before about single or multiple attestation, that's one of the ways, if multiple different sources, hostile, some of them not, are saying the same thing, this tradition, that's one of the ways that historians say, well, that's more likely to be the case since this name is so prevalent. Another one of the methodological tools that you would say on this is to say, well, is it embarrassing? And then 3, is it important? And so because, unlike Bethlehem, Nazareth has no prophecies about it, and indeed it's such an important town that it was never mentioned in any historical source that has made it down to us until it's associated with the name Jesus. It is a real town, it exists, etc. It still does. Yeah, we'll have a picture of it next. But anyway, anyway, there's no reason you pick that out of your hat to make him be from Nazareth. In fact, if you were going to make him, if you didn't know where Jesus was from, and you were going to make him be from anywhere, you'd make him be from Bethlehem, because they constantly want that because of the prophecy. And so they wouldn't have even ever included this Nazareth thing if they didn't have to. So, what about this? There's no prophecies about Nazareth? Well, what about the one that we just quoted in Matthew? He said, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled, he will be called a Nazarene. That exists nowhere in the Hebrew Bible. So that, where has Matthew got that prophecy? So anyway, there's not from the Bible anyway. So he's created a prophecy here to find a justification for the embarrassing fact that the historical Jesus is from Nazareth and not from Bethlehem, right? So, okay, so what's the motivation here? How does that work?
Dude, I got the same thing again.
Look at it.
Come on,
we look at our other nativity gospel for comparison.
Maybe something else.
So writing at about the same time as the author of Matthew, but without access to Matthew. So Matthew and Luke, these are not their real names, but we call them that by convention. They're anonymous evangelists. They both have access to a lot of the same sources, but they don't have access to each other's work. And so they have the same problems, but because they're both creative, they come up with their different solutions. So what Luke decides, anyway, to deal with the same problem is, okay, Jesus is from Nazareth, and yet Jesus is the fulfillment of prophecy, and prophecy says he's from Bethlehem. Same problem that Matthew has. So what we have in Luke is that Joseph and Mary are actually from Bethlehem, but there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus. What? From Nazareth. Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah. They're actually from Nazareth. I'm sorry. Yes, they're up there in Nazareth. But there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed, and so they have to go back to their homeland, which is Bethlehem. However, that also is not just like the Massacre of Innocents, that is not a historical event. There's no such decree, and indeed no census in any time in human history does the government say, you must go back to where your ancestors are from. But the reason why governments, including the imperial government of the Roman Empire, conduct censuses, so they want to know where you live right now so they can tax you. And even so all the world can be taxed. So these are not historical. It's inspired, the Massacre of Innocents is just inspired by the Exodus story. And we should point out that the Exodus story is also not historical, so there's no historical basis probably for the Massacre of the Innocents at Moses' birth. Anyway, so since so much of the life of Jesus was unknown to the evangelists, and since they were convinced that Jesus' life had been lived according to Scripture, that is essentially the earliest creed that Paul, who's the earliest Christian writer, spreads. He's essentially that Christ lived according to Scripture, that he died according to Scripture, and that he rose again according to Scripture. That's what the Christians understood. Therefore, the evangelists felt very free to fill in the details based on the prophecies of the Hebrew Bible. So they didn't have the details of Jesus' life. They had the Bible and what would happen according to the prophecies, and so they were able to say, knowing what this says, we know what he must have done. Although when you work out the details, as in the case of the nativity stories, they can be completely different and contradictory the way that they wrote the details in, as in the Matthew and Luke stories. So, there's no historical magi, and there was no historical star. If we read it, the idea of the star moving around and then stopping right over the city, this is a pretty problematic astronomically. And nevertheless, it doesn't stop. Urgen sent me an article with the actual astronomer who I think is not Christian, but just interested in the question, spent like 10 years and has 4 different answers to what the star could potentially be. The historian is what you have to go to first, I think, then before we're starting to work on this. So there's no reason to credit this account as a historical account because, again, it's not multiply attested. There's no other mention of the star. Even in Matthew's account of it, the star's function is not physical. It's literary. This is not how stars operate, right? So this should not be read as historically, and we shouldn't be using astronomy. Instead, what we really should be doing, I think, is to be working out what the author's actual intent is. And their actual intent here is theological, and that's where we can actually find the story's meaning. So this is actually presented if you actually ever sang the We Three Kings of Orient Are song all the way through. We usually only sing the one verse, I think. Well, Elizabeth sings all the verses because it's fun. So we have the first verse with kind of an overview, and then we have 3 verses, 1 for each king and 1 for each gift, right? And then there's a sum-up verse. And so the 4th verse then, the 3rd king's verse is, myrrh is mine, its bitter perfume, breathes the life of gathering gloom, sorrowing, sighing, bleeding, dying, sealed in the stone-cold tomb. That's quite a birthday present for a newborn baby. But the idea of it is, and the whole reason is, why are you bringing myrrh? Why are you bringing embalming fluid why are you bringing embalming oil to a newborn born baby? In the Life of Brian movie, when the 3 wise men show up at Brian's house, Brian's mother was saying, well, great about the gold and the frankincense, but you can go easy on the myrrh next time. We don't really need that, right? So why do you want myrrh? And it's because, again, Matthew's creating the story to prefigure his understanding of what the life of Christ is about, right? And so it's not meant to be a historical event, frankly, about anything that is happening. Rather, what it's saying is we're seeing here a full picture. And there's other verses that are Christ, essentially born to die. In other words, this is part of the entire cycle of the sacred story. Elizabeth.
Gold is for the
Mainstream.
king, incense is for the god, and myrrh is for the sacrificial